a job in high school? I know people like once you got out of high school and stuff, you worked and everything, but just about everybody did. Okay, so what was the job? What was the job in high school and or college? Like if you had to work during college, but what was the job, and then how much did you like it, not like it? What was the job? Go ahead, Linda. A dishwasher at Smitty's? Sweeney's Steakhouse. Sweeney's Steakhouse. 75 cents an hour. And thought you were doing great, right? Oh, sorry. I don't know. Maybe that was a good wage. I don't know. Yeah. How long did you have that job? Okay. Okay. So pretty much the summer before your senior year. Okay. 42 hours a week for 75 cents an hour. Okay, Sherry, what was it?
I worked in the hometown cafe.
The hometown cafe.
I did the cooking, I did the dishes, I did
You did everything. You cooked, you washed, you did everything.
I got a quarter an hour.
A quarter an hour.
Wow.
Okay.
1963.
1963, and you're just getting a quarter an hour? Yeah, but still, holy cow.
The only thing, like the dinners, the lady I worked for, she'd take all the credit for making it. I cooked them all.
You were doing the cooking, but she got the credit for it. Yeah.
But it was so funny that year, I just happened to be chosen as the local snow queen.
Oh,
And the old bachelor wanted to.
I always forget. Is this North Dakota, South Dakota? South Dakota. Thank you.
The old bachelor wanted to sponsor me, and he had some type of shop or something.
Uh-huh.
And he came in, and I was just amazed. He stuck $20 under his plate when he left, and he said,
Wow. Wow, for you to be the snow queen. A $20 tip when you're making a quarter an hour. That's I was going to say, that's a big deal. And at this you're in high school? This is starting to sound a little creepy actually. Some man just hands you $20.
Before that, I cleaned people's houses and worked out. And
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
So that was really a good job.
Yeah, okay. Phyllis, you said you worked.
I was a clerk at
Howard's Discount Store. Okay. Where was Howard's Discount Store?
where the old food town south. You may not even remember.
No, on Poplar and 8th Street. Yeah, I know where you're talking. No, further south. I know what you're talking about. Past Ulrich. Yep, I know what you're talking about.
You know who the Howards were?
I don't know.
Have you ever heard of Duck Dynasty?
Yes.
Okay, the oldest son, or not the oldest son, but the son that's the host of that this show,
Mhm.
Billy, his in-laws are the Howards.
Okay.
That owned that.
Yep.
They had a chain. It was before Walmart came in, and then Sam Walker went down and bought out Howard.
See, and I thought all their money came from songbooks.
Well, they do have Howard Publishing.
No, I'm serious. Like Howard Publishing, that's where all the Church of Christ used to get their songbooks was from Howard Publishing. So, because I went to school, he was 2 years behind me, but I went to school with Ryan Howard,
Okay, well,
who was connected.
John Howard.
Okay. Mhm.
John Howard, who was the son, who is now the patriarch. But
Gotcha.
At that time, he was the son of the original Howard.
Yeah.
Did all that.
Yeah. Interesting. Yes, ma'am.
My first job, real job, and I have no idea what I got paid because I don't remember things like that. But I gift wrapped during the Christmas holidays at a department store.
Okay.
And it was fun.
All you did was just gift wrapping. That was it.
It was gift wrapping.
Okay.
Back then, you bought something and you could take it over to the gift
Mhm.
wrappers and they'd wrap it for free.
Yeah.
You know, the most challenging thing was somebody bought a rocker.
How do you wrap a rocking chair? That's right. There's a bow. Merry Christmas. What department store?
Anthony's. It was just I don't even think it was a chain. Was it a chain? I didn't know. Our little town had one.
Mm-hmm.
Our town was small.
Yeah. What town?
Batesville.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. All right, Sharon.
I worked at my dad's, we owned a gas station and bake and tackle business, and we worked at the family business.
Yeah.
Pump gas,
You did like you helped do all the changing oil and all that kind of stuff.
My dad said that he wanted his daughters to learn two things: how to change a tire and how to shoot a gun.
Yeah.
So that if you're stuck by the side of the road, you can change the tire, and if anybody bothers you,
You can shoot a gun. Yeah.
But I got paid $50 a week.
Wow, that's good. Yeah.
But he threw in too. When I wasn't working at the gas station, I was watching my little brother and sister.
Okay.
And I was taking care of the cows and the pigs and the chickens that we had on the farm.
Right.
So it was a double duty. But I spent weekends working at the gas station.
Yeah.
And then during the week working at the house.
Now you said there was a gas station and bait and tackle shop. So did you have to go catch the worms and put them in the things in the cups?
I learned how to count by counting worms because my dad bought worms in these big, huge containers.
Uh-huh.
And we counted them out by 20, 50, and 100.
You'd have to count out worms?
Counted out worms, and that was how I learned to count. So when I got to first grade, because they didn't have kindergarten
Right.
back then,
Yeah.
which really amazed my grandchildren.
Yeah.
My grandma never went to kindergarten.
Yeah.
But when I got to first grade, I could count to 100, and they were just really pretty darn impressive.
Yeah. And you were like, well, it's worms. I got it.
Yeah,
We have worms, dear. We have worms in our house. Yeah.
How funny.
Well, how fun.
All right.
I did all through high school.
Yeah.
Did you actually have to catch the worms?
So you worked at a gas station changing oil, counting worms, all that kind of stuff. Brandon worked at a frozen yogurt place. So so he can't change oil. He doesn't want to count worms, but he can get you a cup of frozen yogurt. So yeah. Hey, it was a good job though.
And I bet it paid more than $1.25 an hour.
Probably so.
But back then, it was full service. I mean, you
Oh, sure. Sure.
wash windshield.
Yeah.
Gas, I remember, was 19 cents a gallon.
Yeah.
Every time I fill up, I'm like going,
Remember those days? Yeah. My dad had his own auction business, so most of my working, but like in elementary school on, was either helping set up, the merchandise and stuff ahead of time, which could be easy or it could be really, depending on what we were selling. He was an auctioneer, so it's an auction business. So, but he sold everything, like farms, households, real estate, just everything. So, what the fun when I was in junior high, before I probably even had a driving permit, he would let me be the one, like if he had cars to sell as part of like an estate sale or something. He let me be the one to park it, like move them from wherever out front, and then when he wanted to, hey, well, let's fire this engine up, and he'd toss me the keys. I'm like, yeah, like all I'm doing is starting a car, but to me it's like a really big deal. But then my senior year of high school, I worked in. It used to be Bell's, and it was Bell Ladyman department store. Does anybody remember Bell Ladyman department store? There was one in Rogers for a little while, but there was one in Fort Smith, and I worked for about 4 months, hated every minute of it, and I say that. I had odd jobs. There's another guy, I've told y'all before about a guy from our church that had a freight store that I worked, just really unpacking boxes and moving pallets and all that kind of stuff. But the department store was like a permanent, like that was a full-time job. You had to clock in, you had, and it was $3 something an hour, and just getting into my senior year, and I was missing out on some stuff, and I was like, the guy that used to let me work at his freight store had told me one time, you've got your whole life to work, and if it's not something that you like, if you're not relying on this money, I could get gas money from my parents if I needed to, or I could do some odd jobs here and there and make some money, but I didn't need that to help pay for school or anything like that. So he's like, you got your whole life to work, so just bear that in mind. So I quit. So yeah. So and probably the worst part about it, honestly, part of it was we weren't as popular stores like JCPenney and Sears and things like that. The other thing was wearing a coat and tie every day, and then we weren't allowed to sit down. Like had to stand the whole time. And which is not a problem when you're busy, but when there's nobody coming through and you've already fixed all the hangers and arranged like you're just standing there. My feet would start aching. I'm sure it was psychological, but I hated that job. The reason I asked, and what did you think about, jobs that you've had and ways that you've, been a part of the workforce and stuff. Because if we were going to write a job description, or if you were just going to kind of explain about it to somebody, like just as far as Christianity goes, is just being a Christian, to somebody who doesn't know that much about it, beyond just, I don't want to trivialize it by saying the obvious of you receive forgiveness of sins, you're going to go to heaven, you have this connection with other people, there's all those things. But as far as like living the Christian life, and here's what you need to do, and here's kind of the job description, so to speak, of being a Christian. What are some of the things that would be on that job description? If you're going on Indeed and you're looking up, I want to be a Christian, like what's on the job description? Okay, you can't be a time waster. You got to be active. Okay? You just turned Lou off from being a Christian right there. Yeah. What else? What comes to mind? What are the things that, like, this is what it looks like. This is what you got to do to be a Christian. Love your neighbor. Okay? Got to love people. What else? Understanding. What do you mean? Help me understand. Understanding. Okay. Yeah, understand where people are coming from, and that's part of, like, you have to do that if you're going to be a Christian. You got to have some understanding. Okay, good. Anything else? Watch your speech. We've talked about that, right? No unwholesome talk. Careful with your gossip. All that kind of stuff, right? Be kind. Be compassionate. Do good things for people. Hmm? Mm-hmm. It's a pyramid scheme. I'm being recruited, but I'm recruiting other people. Yeah, it's supposed to be. That's what he told us, right? Go make disciples. Yeah, inviting other people to be a part of it too, for sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Yeah, yeah. It's not a scheme. It's not a scheme. I didn't mean it that way. And that's right. My mansion in heaven keeps getting bigger the more other people are. Yeah. That's not true. Anybody who's watching online, that's not the way it works. I'm being facetious. The reason I ask, and I want us to be thinking about this, because one of the things, and you guys kind of mentioned or kind of hinted at it with, doing good things and being compassionate and stuff, but there's and making disciples, as Brandon mentioned, but there's a key element that without coming out and saying you can't be a Christian without doing this. It's certainly implied multiple times in Scripture. This is part of what living the Christian life looks like. Okay, I'll explain that. In Ephesians chapter 5, that's where we're at right now. Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 21. No, you're in. Yeah. Y'all are going to love today's class. Oh, look at the time. We got to... Okay, let's start with verse 21, and I want to read into chapter 6. So this is going to be kind of a long reading. So follow along, and if you're online, hope you can find a Bible app and follow along with us as well. Verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word. And he presented himself... I'm sorry, I got to get the glasses out. and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it, just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. Verse 31, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Children, in chapter 6 now, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. We'll stop right there. So there's a kind of a theme. There's for sure one word, but it carries a theme through the rest of what Paul talks about here. And what's the overall theme? What's the overall concept that Paul is trying to get across in what we just read?
Besides the obvious submission, I think humility is in there as well.
Yeah. The key thing is submission, right? I mean, that's what he says right off the bat there in verse 21. And that continues through the rest of what we just read, okay? Now, let's break it down a little bit more like he does. So what's the first thing, when he starts giving examples of submission, what's the first thing that he talks about? No, the verses after that. Okay, husbands and wives. What does he say? Who's he talk to first? What?
What? Well, let me tell you what.
Okay.
In verse 21, it says, submitting to one another
Mm-hmm.
in the fear of God.
Right.
So, is that not before wives and stuff?
Absolutely. So, okay, let me backtrack a little bit, because I guess I got ahead of myself. Okay, verse 21, he kind of sets the stage here, right? Submit to one another, and yours says out of fear of God. In the fear of God. Okay, I've got out of reverence for Christ. Okay, and that fear is not being afraid of God. It is a reverence. It is a recognition and awe, and wanting to wanting to submit to that power. Okay, that's where that fear comes from. But submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, reverence for God, out of my willingness to serve God, out of my recognition that God deserves to be revered and honored and served. I'm going to submit to other people. And that is, it's like, go back to the pyramid scheme. Here's a statement, here's all this stuff underneath it. Like it's this very powerful statement, this very powerful challenge that Paul gives the Ephesian church. Submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. But then, and this is what I was trying to get at, the verses after that, the verses following after that, everything point from here through, and I didn't even read about slaves and masters going on into chapter 6, but everything from 5 verse 22 to 6 verse 9 points back to 5 verse 21. Does that make sense? Here's the statement. Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. Now, I'm going to show you how to do that. And he's done something like similar to this already as far as just, his literary style or how he's writing this letter. If you go back to chapter 4 and he says, you got this old self and this new self, and you need to be the new self. You have this new person that you are in Christ now. Let me show you practical ways to do that. And that's what we've been going through in chapters 4 and 5, right? Be honest. Don't be fake. Have encouraging words, not unwholesome talk. No sexual immorality. All those different things we've been talking about the last 2 or 3 weeks. Point back to chapter 4, verses 22 and 23 and 24, where you got the old self and the new self. Does that make sense? And also, he kind of bookends it because he talks about being children of light too. Okay? So, here he is again making this, I guess a broad statement, but just this one central challenge, this one central theme. Okay, we need to submit to one another. Now, yeah, case study is a good word. It would be as if somebody, is reading Paul's letter in front of the church in Ephesus and going, okay, the next thing Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And maybe they took a pause and somebody's like, how do we do that? He's already answering the question. Okay, let me show you what that looks like. That was what I was trying to say. And I probably didn't say that very clearly. I got ahead of myself. Okay, so these next few verses, going all the way halfway through chapter 6 just about, is Paul giving practical examples of here's what it looks like to submit to one another. First thing he says is what? Now we'll get back to that. Wives do what? Submit to your husbands. Oh, man. Yes, submit to your own husbands. Not Lou wants to make sure we get own in there. I ain't got to submit to... Oh, my goodness. But he qualifies it, okay? Okay, let's back up. Why is it that okay, I'll put it this way. It seems like most women, at least nowadays, and y'all can tell me if I'm wrong, this is perception, just bristle a little bit, just kind of cringe a little bit at that statement, why submit to your husbands? And it's very awkward and uncomfortable for the two men in the room to read this out loud about wives submitting to their husbands. It's like, am I allowed to say that? Is that, because it's not politically correct. And why is it so just uncomfortable? Why are those words so uncomfortable to us?
I think in the olden days they took it such brimstone and fire, and you're my wife and you're going to do what they read it differently than how it was meant to be read.
Yeah, and so if maybe some time ago there was much more emphasis on wives, you better submit to your husbands. Okay? Back in Paul's time? Mm-hmm.
So it would become like when he goes on to talk about slaves submitting to your master.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost to that. The women had really
Wives did not have nearly as much rights in society back in that time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That's a good point. Anybody else?
I think he just wanted to just offer examples that they would understand.
Mm-hmm.
Something that was, oh, I get it. Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
In terms that, they really could understand and bring it down to a level
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
So, and that's what their world.
He's using a very practical example for them, for sure.
Those are really good words, practical examples.
Yeah. Yeah. But why do we not like it now? Why do we I mean, why do preachers like, I ain't preaching on that? And why do we kind of breeze past it really fast when we are doing Bible studies?
Well, I think society has created, a culture of, that, has changed the thinking
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to husbands and wives and what the traditional idea. I mean, let's face it, traditional idea of marriage and family is totally different in our culture now.
Sure.
And I think it just kind of upsets people when it's something they don't like to hear.
Yeah. I think that you bring up a very good point about, traditional concepts and stuff, and culture is not what it was. I mean, culture is not what it was 20 years ago, much less, 50 or 80 years ago, right? So it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, and it's not. I'm not saying that in a bad way. I think that the way we have moved forward over the last at least 40, 50 years, to go back to what Lou was talking about, 2,000 years ago, the kind of almost oppression that women lived under. And I know there's some feeling of that even all the way up to, the 1900s, but I feel like we're taking steps forward, and have moved much further forward in our culture than we used to be. I'm not saying we're all the way there, but because we are moving in the direction of more, not just rights for women, but equality and more women in workplaces and social situations that used to only be acceptable for men to be a part of. Then this seems archaic. Is that fair? It seems very stifling, and it's almost like we're a society that's moved past this. So let's not even talk about it because this is not where our culture is anymore. You don't think that's true? Okay.
I think it's true that our culture has moved forward,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the Bible's for all time. So consequently, this verse is, and I hate to say this out loud, but I think this verse means what it says,
Mm-hmm.
is that in the Lord, when it's things to do with biblical and raising your family as Christians, and if the husband is the Christian that he should be, then he should be the leader, and I shouldn't come along and say, no, we're not going to go to church today because I want to go to such and such.
Right.
He as the spiritual leader of the house,
Mm-hmm.
the home, should be the man that wants to be leading his family in the way that Christ wants him to.
So men should be the leaders, and if they are,
A lot of it is spiritual leaders.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because he's talking about Christians and how Christians should behave. So I think a lot of this is not talking about things like owning property or,
Working certain jobs or things like that. Mm-hmm.
I think it's in the fact as Christians, the husband should be the one that sets the Christian tone for the family, and the wife should be willing to submit to that.
Okay, so you feel like this is, I guess, limited somewhat to talking about spiritual connection and spiritual leadership in the home.
Isn't that kind of what we've been talking about, is how to be good Christians in this whole thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Okay.
Just want to be sure.
Yeah.
What do you say?
What
What
about
about
your
you?
translation of the word submit as it's used up there?
That's a good question. I didn't look up the Greek word for this. I know that there's a difference, like later on when he talks about slaves. There's this would be similar to the word that's used in Philippians chapter 2 when it says your attitude should be the same as Christ Jesus. I'm going to misquote it, so let me read it real quick. Who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. And so there was slave and there was servant. There's two different words. They're similar in as far as their meaning, but you would have servants who were might have even a few rights. They might be servants in a home, or they might be servants. You might even call like some of your city workers and maybe even politicians servants of the people. So it's not necessarily slaves without any rights, but they were submitting. The actions they were taking were for the benefit of other people, and maybe that was a household servant, or maybe it was a servant of the people. That kind of thing. Slave was you had no rights of your own. You were completely submissive to whoever it was that owned you. Now, in Greek and Roman culture, you could work your way out of that, but it was very similar to, somewhat similar to what we think of, even back in the 1800s here in our country of, American slavery, where you had no rights, you had no freedoms, you were completely at the will of your master. And that is, honestly, the kind of picture most often used in the New Testament when it talks about being servants and being slaves, and we use those Greek words. It's usually in that concept of like you forfeit your rights. You are willingly saying, I am going to put myself at your disposal and let you call the shots. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the concept there. So again, it bothers us, especially in our 21st century culture, to tell wives, well, you need to submit to your husbands. And I don't know if it was you, I was telling somebody last week that, there was a time when the wedding vows, the wives are supposed to love, honor, and obey, right? Love, honor, and obey your husband. And that's gone away. I used to have, when I was planning weddings for people I was doing the ceremony, that like inevitably, there would be brides be like, I'm not saying obey. I'm like, fine, whatever you want to say, I don't care. But when Christian and I got married, she was working in the admissions office at Harding University, and had women her age, college age, and even a couple of young wives there. But then there were also some women who were older. They could have been her mom, some of them probably even her grandma. And so she was, one day it's kind of slow in the office, and she was writing our vows. Like I didn't even write them; she wrote them. I was like, sounds good to me. So that's how much help I did with the planning. But anyway, there were some of those older women like, you better put obey in there, put to obey in there, because nobody says that anymore. And she's like, all right, and she did. She put it in our ceremony. And my dad was the one that was officiating our ceremony. And so we're standing there, and he's giving me these phrases, repeat after him, and I'm saying all these things that, that I'm vowing to her. And then when it's her turn, she's repeating back to me. And when she had written the vows, I'd have to go back and read them, but I'm just going to say, love, honor, and obey. I don't know for sure if that's what it actually was, but it was something along those lines. And my dad changed it as she was repeating. He's like, love and honor. And he said, instead of saying and obey, he said, and to obey. And he also kind of ran that together, where it sounded like to obey. You know what I'm saying? He's like, and to obey. And she just misunderstood. We're up in front of everybody, and it wasn't what she had typed out. And so it didn't sound right. And so it just threw her off. And so he's like, and to obey. And then I think we were holding hands, but anyway, she just paused. She looked at him kind of confused. And then he's like, and to obey. And she's like, oh, and she repeats it. Of course, everybody starts dying laughing. So then when we had the receiving line, people were coming up, and the whole, what everybody in the crowd read that as, well, she didn't want to say it. And they're like, oh yeah, the hard part of that, had a hard time with that obey part, didn't you? And she's like, no, anyway. So, and my dad was so apologetic. He's like, I didn't want, anyway. But we don't like that. We don't like that obeying other people and this submission. We almost wish, and I'm saying, even me as a male reads this, I'm like, man, Paul, couldn't you have worded that a little bit different? But I think, go ahead. Okay. I think that, okay. I think it goes back again to verse 21, submit to one another. And so the first thing he talks about is marriage. Well, there needs to be submission in marriage. Wives, submit to your husbands. Now, Lou brought up a very good point. In the Jewish culture, read through the Old Testament, there were not many rights for women. And I was reading something earlier this week where somebody was earlier this last week, where somebody was pointing this out and saying, it even talks about, I think it's in Deuteronomy, where the Israelites are going to come into the promised land with their sets of laws, and the nations around them were going to be so amazed with their sets of laws that they're going to want they're going to be like, where'd you get those laws? How do you have a culture like this? And the author that was writing this was like, how bad was it for those women in those other cultures when you see some of the laws that seem to benefit men more than women, even in the Old Testament? It must have been, if they're going to look at that, if we take the Bible as word, and they're going to be like, man, your culture is awesome. How bad was it for women in those other cultures, And it was. And when you get into Jesus' day, women, for the most part, didn't have a whole lot of rights. They were treated just above, or viewed kind of just above slaves. You didn't talk to them in public. You didn't. There was a whole lot of just not even what you see in Scripture, but just societal rules and some things, some rabbinical, some rabbi laws outside of what we have in Scripture that even talked about. This is the way women should act, and if they don't, basically keeping them under the men's thumb. In Roman culture, there's a little bit more freedom. I say that. They still weren't looked on very highly. they still had to kind of, if they were married, they were still kind of under the rule of whoever the husband was. If they weren't married, they were under the rule of the father. But there was a little bit more independence there, where they could own some of their own property. They couldn't hold a political office, but they could exercise influence over the husbands that did. And then I didn't know this until just yesterday. I was reading through some stuff yesterday. And if in Roman society, Roman citizens, if a woman had at least 3 children, if she didn't want to be married to that husband anymore, she could be the one to initiate divorce, and she could live independently because let me take that back. Not 3 children, 3 sons, because she had kind of proved that childbearing and producing this family is a big responsibility, and obviously she's mentally intelligent enough. Besides procreating, she can manage a household with multiple kids. So we will allow her to start managing her own life. And I know this stuff kind of sounds completely foreign, but to us nowadays. But that's the way that it was. Now, Christianity comes along. I'm making this really long. I got to keep track of time. Christianity comes along. And if you think about it, and we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to this, Jesus really went against culture when it came to how he dealt with women. Women were disciples. There weren't any women that were disciples or rabbis, and he allowed women to be disciples of his. Women, if a rabbi, not at the synagogue, but if just out in public in the marketplace or even at someone's home, if people asked him questions and he started to teach, women were allowed to be a part of that. And we have in Luke chapter 10, we have Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, and he's fine with that. He's allowing her, to be a part of that. He spoke to women in public. He spoke to the Samaritan woman. The Samaritan woman is even surprised. I remember that when Jesus starts talking to her, he says, "Can I have a drink?" She's like, "Why are you even talking to me?" Because you didn't do that. Rabbis in the Jewish culture didn't do that, much less that she was a Samaritan. But the fact that he was even addressing a woman in public, he just didn't do that. And there's more examples we get into. But yes, ma'am.
Was a rabbi allowed to be married?
Oh, yes, for sure. Most rabbis were, for sure. But you didn't talk to other rabbis' wives, and you didn't, the wives in Jewish culture. The wives' basic job was to make babies and take care of the home, and they weren't educated. They weren't allowed to be educated. Like I said, you had exceptions to the rule here and there, but for the most part, Jewish women, especially where Jesus lived, were very almost secluded from the rest of the society, except for each other and their kids. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Husbands are supposed to love their wives just as Christ loved the church.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Christ's love is a perfect love.
Mm-hmm.
But verse 22, wives, submit to your husband as to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
A husband's love is never going to be a perfect love.
Right.
So when he is not submitting to the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
is she still supposed to submit to him?
Okay. Can you hold the question? It's a very good question. So hold on to it for just a second. Okay. And don't. No.
There's a caveat.
Yes. No.
As to the Lord.
Yeah. It's a good question. Let me pause on it for just a second. Let me finish my train of thought before I forget, because I want to address that. Okay, so with Jesus, again, there's more liberation for women. Okay? Then you get into the book of Acts. There are women prophets. There are women, we read through 1 Corinthians. There are women who are praying. They are prophesying. So there's much more. When the first convert in the city of Philippi was Lydia, a woman, right? And they met in her home. So there's a lot more. Huh?
There were deaconesses too.
Yes. Or deacons' wives, if you want to read it that way. But yes, there were deaconesses. And Paul even talks about that. You're right. There's women that Paul says, I couldn't do the ministry that I did if it wasn't for this woman. So I'm trying to build to, in this new religious movement of Christianity back in this time, there was much more freedom for women than there were in almost any other religion and really in society in general. So, what would be a danger? Danger's not the right word, but what would be one of the problems that would probably come out of that as far as the church is concerned? If you have these women who have been stifled, whether that was the right thing to do or not, they've been for generations have been just kind of held down and stifled, and now there's this freedom, and they get to participate, and not just participate as an observer. They're given spiritual gifts, and they're allowed to have maybe even some leadership. What's one of the problems that might possibly be produced by that? Part of it would be odd for men who had witnessed generations of women being kind of held down to now see them on an equal level. That would be part of it for sure. And the other part of it is there's probably some of these women who would be abusive of that. And I'm not saying anyone in this room, just talking about women in general. That would be, because I have this new freedom, I want to keep exercising that authority. As a matter of fact, I'm going to kind of flaunt it. And even using that freedom wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing until it becomes all about themselves. I want to do this because I want people to see me, and I want to put myself up in front. And maybe there's this man that's kind of been leading over here, but I'm going to kind of push him out of the way because I want to be in charge now. And it was creating, there's the potential. And I think this is why Paul addresses it. There's either it was absolutely happening in Ephesus, or there was the potential for it to happen in Ephesus, where it's just going to create divisiveness. It's going to create problems. Not because women have these gifts and abilities, but because they're abusing their right, and they're creating divisiveness and division and animosity because of it. Exactly.
It's not about Christ. And because it's funny with these verses that we struggle with, it's because we're just looking at that verse, but everything is so intertwined that the worldly version of this is so messed up. But then if you recognize what Christ is calling us to, taking in, Christ is asking us to have no voice, have no reason, have no being. We're his body. We're here to serve him and be in a good place with that. And so, I don't know, I think the version of submission that the world creates is so chaotic. And taking it from the Bible, biblical is it's all one, I don't know.
We're supposed to be benefiting each other.
Yes,
we're supposed to be blessing each other.
If you take one without the other, then it's just misconstruing everything. If you mix it together, then it is that you're building these beautiful blocks.
Yeah, you're building this body, which he's already talked about, in this letter even. We're making this stronger, for sure. So, again, the first thing he says is submit to each other. Who's he talking to? Everybody. Everybody. Y'all need to submit to each other. Now let's get practical. Wives, I know you have freedoms that you haven't had before. I know that you have gifts that you haven't had before. I know the temptation is going to be to make that all about you. And maybe even become hateful or spiteful to your husband. Don't do that. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. Okay? Because nobody would say, well, I ain't submitting to Jesus, right? Submit to your husband in the same way that you would to Jesus. Now, if, I haven't forgot your question, I'm coming. If this letter is being read and Paul says this, wives, submit to your husbands, and that's being read out loud in the church, what's going to be the immediate reaction on the husband's part? That's right. Wives, submit to your husbands. Amen. Yeah. Let's have the invitation song. Let's wrap this up. But before they can have those thoughts, what's the next thing he says? And he changes the words, but not the concept. Okay? Wives, submit to your husbands, but husbands do what? Love your wives, but he qualifies it. How, I can be like, I love my wife. But he qualifies it. How, with what kind of love? What does that need to look like? As Christ loved the church. How much did Christ love the church? Paul even talks about it. Totally. What did he do? Completely sacrificed everything. Okay? This goes beyond just the crucifixion itself. Jesus is the creator of the universe. And he walked away from that, left that to come to this earth, and not only come to this earth, but to allow his own creation to call the shots. And he looked at what their needs were, and he healed people, and he talked to people, and he met people where they were. That's not what a king does. The subjects submit to the king. The subjects ask the king, what is it that you want? What can we do for you? The king doesn't do that for the subjects. But that's what Jesus did. Why? Because he loved us that much. So much so that he went to the cross. So much so that he took on sin that he didn't have to take on. So much that he experienced death. An eternal being chose to experience death. And then come back again. And just the hell that he went through at the cross and that whole experience. Just because he loved us. Paul says, husbands, that's what it needs to look like with your wife. That's the kind of love that she needs from you. So you can celebrate all you want to, this submission that wives are supposed to have for husbands. There's pretty big submissiveness on your part. And it's not, I think it's intentional on Paul's part. He doesn't use the word submit, he uses the word love. Because love, sometimes I'm submissive because I have to be. Somebody else is going to call the shots. We talked about the jobs we had earlier, right? I'm going to submit to my boss. He's going to make me do stuff, that I don't want to do. Washing those dishes that I didn't want to wash. Cooking those things in the diner that I didn't want to cook. Whatever. I had to wear a coat and tie and stand the whole time. I had to submit to that, right? Wasn't my choice. I had to do it. It's out of obligation. Husbands aren't submitting to their wives out of obligation or just keeping the peace or whatever. They're loving them. I want to sacrifice. I want to submit. I want to meet your needs because I care about you that much. That's what it's supposed to look like. And that points back to verse 21 as well. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, submit to your wives. Submit to them in a way that Christ submitted to us. He submitted his will to us.
Kind of like the way I kind of hadn't heard it, I guess, and so now because it's like, man, verse 22 is such a hang up of that. Why do you submit? Golly, man, and it's not a because you are inferior, you must submit to me. But then what he calls husbands to? It's like, okay, well, here's a submission out of love and stuff like that, but that may be happening. But are you ready to die? There's
Yeah.
so much expected of husbands. It's here's the deal. If you are going to be worthy of your wife submitting and loving you in that way, you better be ready to die in an instant.
Yeah.
For her.
Yeah.
To look to her interests the best, and you submit to her in this
Mhm.
case too. And it's man, wives submit to your husbands. Golly, that's so cumbersome. But he's husbands, you need to die like Christ died.
Yeah.
Sacrificing everything.
Yeah.
Eternity.
It is mutual submission, but it's a choice to do it. And I think the reason that he uses submit for wives is because, again, in the culture of the time, in the society of the time, some of them had to. A lot of them had to, because that's what society demanded. You have to submit to your husband. And so there's part of Paul that's like, okay, yeah, do that, because you need to be submissive. You need to surrender your will. You can go ahead and do that. But husbands, let's flip the script here. Most of the society these guys lived in, husbands didn't have to submit to their wives. They didn't have to. Some of them might. There were good men living back then. But then, well, Jesus, I don't know. Yeah. But you know what I'm saying? Like it's trying to squash anybody feeling like they have the right to be dominant in a relationship. Does that make sense? The way that I'm saying that, like it's a mutual submission to each other. Now, I want to hit it. So ask your question again, because I don't want to get confused.
Okay, if the husband is not in submission to Christ,
Mm-hmm.
then is the wife still supposed to be submissive to the husband?
And there was a verse that you were pointing to.
Right? As to the Lord.
Yes, verse 25 says for husbands to love your wives just as Christ loved the church.
Okay.
But back to 22, it says wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord.
Mm-hmm. So if a husband,
She's not in submission to Christ, is she still obligated?
okay. So the question is, if wives are supposed to submit to their husbands to the Lord, and husbands are supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church, if a husband doesn't love his wife as Christ loved the church, and he's not meeting her needs the way that Christ did for us, is she still obligated to be submissive? Man, obligated is a big word. So I think here's how I'll answer it for now. Ideally, yes. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. I don't think I don't let me back up. I don't think wives are called to stay in an abusive relationship. I don't think that's what God wants. I don't think that's what Jesus wants. I don't think that is what's required. We go back again to this concept of submission. When I submit, sometimes it's kind of forced on me. But again, when he says, "Wives, submit to your husband," it's a conscious choice. I am choosing to surrender my will to this other person. So I think, based on the first verse in verse 21, that yeah, wives, if at all possible, even if that man is not following Christ the way that he should, as much as it depends on you, as much as you have the opportunity to be submissive. But here's why I say that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there's a question about marriage. There's several questions about marriage, but one of them that Paul addresses is, what about these wives who have unbelieving husbands? Are they supposed to get divorced because he doesn't believe, she does, he doesn't, she's a Christian, he's not. So that marriage, we need to walk away from that, right? Because it's bad. And Paul's like, no, stay in it. There's no, you don't have to sever that relationship just because one of you is a believer and one of you isn't. And he goes on to say, as a matter of fact, you may be the one to lead your husband to Christ by staying in it and by loving him and being, the kind of wife that you should be. I think the same principle applies to your question. If this person that I'm married to is not following Christ, do I have to stop submitting? I mean, ultimately it's your choice. But I think Paul, again, is addressing just submission as a whole. As much as I can, let me interrupt myself. I want, if possible, to submit to you guys. I want to be aware of what your needs are, and if I can do, I'm not married to all you people, but if I have the ability, if I know what your need is, and I have the ability to do something about it, maybe there's something that I want to accomplish today. But if there's something that I can do for you, then I'm going to put my agenda to the side so I can serve you. That's submission. Okay? You ask something to me, and I'm going to put something that would be important to me to the side so that I can do something that you need done. Would everybody agree? I'm submitting to you and to your needs. Am I saying that correctly? Okay. So I'm going to do that for Brandon. I want to do that for Sharon. Whatever I can do. This is the overall concept that Paul is getting across here. So, bring that back to your question. If I'm just within my home, there are times as a parent, I submit to my kids. Don't tell them that. But we do, right? We put things on hold so that we can meet the needs of our kids, because what they need and be a blessing to them. And I'm going to submit what I would rather do, or the hours of sleep that I could get, or the money that I could spend on something that I want to spend it on. I'm going to submit that to them, right? Okay. Now, do they need to submit to me? Absolutely. Yeah, we can talk about that here in chapter 6 when we get to it. It's a mutual submission. So I think, again, in this marriage, there's going to be times where one of us is not, I'm not going to want to submit to that other person. There may be multiple times. But you ask the question, like, do you have to? It's a choice. I don't want to put you must, obey, you must surrender, you must submit. I don't think Paul's saying it that way. And it's a statement of encouragement. Submit to each other. Wives, submit to your husband. What does he need? See what you can do about that. How can you be a blessing to him? Is there a way for you to put some things that are important to you on hold so that you can be a blessing to him? Husbands, do that for your wives too. There may be some things that you want to do, or a person that you want to be, but you need to take care of your wife. You need to submit to her needs. He's going to go on in a minute to talk about parents and kids. We'll get to that next week. Okay. It would be. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But
Submit's too much like obey.
It's like a weird word.
Yeah.
I don't know if it really means the same thing as like be like a blessing and resource. Then I'm like, I love to do that. That's
yeah,
like right
I like being a blessing. I can do that. Yeah.
resource, like,
Yeah.
right to the household.
But
Submit like has like a weight that's like just a little different.
yeah, it sounds slavish. Yeah. I understand that.
And if you grew up like in a family like I did where they really liked this verse, and then they also like really liked the girls to like cook and clean while the boys were out playing football, it was
Uh-huh.
like really hard to be like like this one.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
it kind of like was too entwined.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I'll tell you this, man, we're already past time. We can pick up here next week, or we can just move on past it. Let's move on past it. No, this just some reading that I did. A lot of it yesterday, and part of it was about this verse in a way that I had never thought of before. And so I'm still chewing on it. I'm going to go ahead and say it and share it with you guys, and y'all can chew on it, see what you think. But he quotes this verse in verse 31. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And that's a quote from the creation story. That's a quote from the creation of Adam and Eve. And so what this guy said was, originally, if you go back to Genesis, before sin, before we get to chapter 3, the guy's original plan was a mutual kind of an equal relationship between husbands and wives. Genesis chapter 1 says he created them male and female, and he talks about how he had Adam, but then he created Eve, but it doesn't say he created Eve to serve Adam. It's a helper. It's a kind of side partner in a way. You know what I'm saying? And so there was a mutual equality and a mutual meeting of the other person's needs, being blessed by the other person. That was the original plan. And then sin entered the world. And when you go beyond that, when you go through the rest of Genesis and on through the Old Testament, you see this skewed version where men are more dominant, women are more inferior, until Jesus comes along. And then Jesus starts to level the playing field. And then Paul, same guy, says over in Galatians, hey, in Christ, there's not male, female. There aren't those labels. We are all one. Why? Because that's the way it was supposed to be. That's the way it started out from the beginning. And when Paul says here, why does he quote that verse in the middle of this? He's talking about headship in the body. This is what I was going to get to. This guy that was reading said, we look at that as head, as authority, and the body do what? Yeah, the boss, and the body has to do what the head says. But he's like, if you think about it, that's not even biologically accurate. Like the head and the body are mutually dependent on each other. The head needs the body needs the head. They have to work together. And maybe they have different functions and different roles, but you got both of them needing the other. You can't have a bodiless head. You can't have a headless body. Like it's not one just because the head sits on top of the body. It's more those two things are joined together. And that's what Paul is getting at here when he says, okay, you got a head and you got a body, but those things need each other. Maybe they have different functions. Maybe they have different traits, but they're mutually dependent on each other. And that's why he quotes Genesis 2:24, the two become one flesh. And they need each other. And they need to fulfill their roles and use their talents and their gifts and abilities, but they also need to be mutually submissive to each other so that the whole body from head to toe functions the way it's supposed to. I don't know. Still, it was interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way before. You had your hand up a minute ago.
Oh man, I know we're running out of time.
Go ahead.
That verse about he created Eve as a helper.
Yeah.
What a sweet bristling word.
Yeah.
Here's the main guy and then the sidecar.
Yeah. We think of a sidekick, like the superhero sidekick, like this guy that, yeah.
Right, you just stay with it. But I was listening to a sermon that was kind of talking about this, and that word helper is used here, but I think it's used like 20 or 30 other times in the Old Testament, referring to God as a helper.
Uh-huh.
So it's like, it's not like this side thing. It's like whenever a woman is the helper in the marriage, it's like we're bringing life and sustenance and goodness and love. Like it's not just this; it's a completion.
Yeah.
Like this is the way that
It's filling in the gaps and doing all the things that this other person can't do. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. For sure. That's and I think that's what Paul is getting at here. And again, why he talks about submission. Submit to each other. Do what the other person needs. And if both husbands and wives are doing that, man, what an awesome marriage. Things tend to go really well when both have that attitude. It's not that I don't have needs, but she's the one that's meeting them for me. It's not that she doesn't have needs. I'm the one meeting them for her. That's the point. That's the way this is supposed to work. The body has needs that the head can fulfill. The head has needs that the body can fulfill. It's supposed to work that way. So the whole body functions the way it's supposed to. Marriages are that way too. Yes, ma'am.
I just remember all years and years that it was said that this is
That's fine.
needs a help need.
Uh-huh.
Needs a help suitable,
Yeah.
which doesn't indicate slavery.
Right.
Dominance.
Right. Or even just,
But I still think the male is the head of the house. I mean, I believe that.
yeah. Well, there's, you know what? Look at the time. Yeah, let's pick up here next week, and I do want to move on to what he says in chapter 6, continuing with this idea of submission. I I hope that helped answer the question. Okay. All right. I know. Well, I mean, okay. Let's just go ahead and cut us off, Brandon. Let's just cut the camera and let's be done. And yeah. Yeah.
Just remember, verse 32 said, "This is a profound mystery."
Yes. Well, and he says, I'm really talking about Christ and the church. I mean, this is really what he's getting at.
Okay, so we're done?
Cameras off, microphones off, right? We're all good.